Today we have new balance changes in Squad Busters. So we're going to be checking all of them out in today's video. I'm going to be going over all the nerfs and buffs for every troop, along with some changes to Angry Vines, Lucky Finds, gems from busts, and spells. Make sure you're using code Claz in the Squad Busters shop if you buy anything, and let's go check out all these changes. Okay, so there are many game changes and troop changes, and we're going to start off with the troop changes. So first of all, the archer used to deal 190 damage. She now deals 210. She used to have 1,200 health. She now has 1,300 health. Also, the arrow volleys that drop from the sky goes from 160 damage to 186 damage, and a fusion arrow volley from a fusion unit goes from 400 damage to 456. So overall, a pretty big buff. The archer queen now goes from having 140 damage to 170, and her HP goes from 1,600 to 1,700. Her explosive arrows damage ability also goes from 220 damage to 243. Now those are all buffs, but she also gets a nerf on her baby ability. You can see here on screen, she makes it so your long range units do slightly less damage. So one archer queen used to get 23% boost. Now you only get 20% boost. And then obviously the further down you go, the more the nerf is obvious. And this might affect the queen and tank combo. The bandit used to deal 180 damage. She now deals 190. The barbarian used to deal 140. Now he deals 150, and his HP goes from 2,050 to 2,150. The barbarian king is also getting a nerf to his baby ability. You can see it's pretty similar to the arch queen, but he used to deal 22% more damage for all your melee units in your squad. Now you only get 20% buff. And then obviously you can see here, the further down you go down this list, the more the nerf is obvious. The battle healer goes from 120 damage to 145, and her HP from 2,400 to 2,600. The B goes from 200 damage to 220 damage, and her HP from 1,300 to 1,400. Also, B's used to deal 100 damage each. Now they deal 115. Bo gets a buff from 125 damage a second to 150, and his HP from 1,200 to 1,300. Also, he now deals 31% more damage against monsters, so from 310 to 406. And the mines that Bo drops deals 600 damage when they used to deal 500, so a 20% buff. The chicken goes from 120 damage to 135, and his HP from 1,550 to 1,700. Ruffles, which we know is probably one of the weakest troops in the game and definitely needed the buff probably the most, he gets a buff. He goes from 235 damage a second to 250, and from 1,700 health to 1,800, because we all know Ruffs just needed that buff. Dynamite goes from dealing 175 damage a second to 190, and his HP from 1,300 to 1,400, and that barrel bomb spell goes from dealing 600 damage to 650, which is an 8% buff. Frank goes from 95 damage a second to 105 damage a second, and his HP from 3,200 to 3,450. Also, the super shockwave damage per second gets buffed from 301 to 336. Also, his ability now charges up faster when you're taking damage to make it so, well, it's a little bit more useful. Goblin goes from 170 damage a second to 190, and his HP from 1,700 to 1,750. Heavy goes from dealing 125 damage a second to 135, and his HP 3,000 to 3,200. Although it's important to note that's how much damage Heavy starts off with. He actually goes all the way up to 264 damage per second if you're standing still long enough, which is a buff from 240 damage a second, which is what he used to do at max damage. Hog received actually a pretty big nerf. Now when you walk over the vines, you no longer get that turbo boost that you used to get, which I'm quite upset about, but he's still a good troop. Ice Wizard goes from dealing 110 damage a second to 120, and his HP 1,300 to 1,400. Leon goes from dealing 320 damage to 330, definitely the most damage dealing unit in the game without abilities, and he goes from 1,700 health to 1,850. Max goes from 200 damage a second to 225, and his HP from 1,550 to 1,700. Miner goes from dealing 130 damage to 145, and his HP from 2,400 to 2,500. Also, when he goes underground and back over ground, he now deals 105 damage when he used to deal 96 damage. And if you stay underground long enough, you get that eruption damage bonus from Ultra Form, and that goes from dealing 180 damage to 198. Mortis goes from 175 damage a second to 190, and his HP from 2,250 to 2,500. Nita gets a pretty huge buff here, from 85 damage to 125. That they're really trying to make Nita better now. And the HP goes from 1,700 to 1,850. Pam receives only a health buff, but she goes from having 1,850 to 2,050. Penny goes from dealing 230 damage a second to 245. Pretty big numbers, not gonna lie. And her HP from 1,700 to 1,750. That's more moderate. Shelly goes from dealing 200 damage to 220, and her HP from 1,850 to 2,000. Also, Shelly's super shell ability at ultra form goes from dealing 400 damage to 425, which is a 6% buff. The witch goes from 230 damage a second to 250, and her health from 1,400 to 1,500. In my opinion, the witch just needs a rework, and I think it should become a rare. I don't think it's epic worthy, because a rare with those stats is actually not bad. And then the final balance changes for the wizard. He goes from dealing 120 damage to 135, and his HP from 1,300 to 1,400. And weirdly enough, Dr. T and the Royal King haven't received buffs at all, which, why? Anyways, let's move to some changes for a few spells. So the lightning goes from dealing 550 damage to 650. The bomb goes from dealing 300 damage to 400 damage. The barrel bomb spell goes from dealing 600 damage to 650. And by the way, I never knew the barrel bomb spell dealt that much damage more than the bomb spell. I guess it is better than I thought. And then the log goes from dealing 200 damage to 250. In the modifier ring grab, rings no longer drop all at once when you lose one troop. You only lose one ring per one troop that you lose in your squad, meaning no longer you're going to lose all your rings in the final 2 seconds of a game when someone takes out one of your troops. In Loot Goblin Rush, you now have a 40% chance of getting a blue turbo boot from a Loot Goblin. And by the way, beforehand, it was a 10% chance. There's going to be a lot of turbo in that mode. In Loot Machines, when you fail to open a loot machine due to lack of coins, the machine will no longer disappear. So it used to disappear if you didn't have enough coins. I guess that's fixed. Although I definitely think loot machines needs better changes. So now we're going to be moving on to some game balances. And first of all, we're going to be starting off with changes to any mode that includes gems. So not showdown. So when you take out someone's troop currently in the game, they drop a couple gems that they have in their squad. And then if you take out their entire squad, they drop all the gems that they have, and that's it. But this is now going to be changed, so they drop extra gems that they don't even have. So for every troop that you take out from somebody, they will drop an extra 8 gems. And when you take out their squad, they will drop an extra 25 gems. So even if someone has 0 gems on them and you kill them, they drop 25 gems plus 8 gems per troop that you take out. I think this is going to mean we're going to see a lot more games where people get 1,000 to 2,000 gems more often. Lucky Finds received a slight rebalancing, not really a nerf, just a rebalancing. So you know that strategy where you run around with 2 troops, you wait for the 2-minute mark, and then you get 4 to 5 Lucky Finds back to back and win the game? Well, that shouldn't be as easy anymore, because the chances to get a Lucky Find actually increase as the game goes along. So when the game starts, you have a very low chance of getting a Lucky Find at the 2-minute mark, and then in the final minute, you have a higher chance. And in fact, in the final 30 seconds of a game, the chances increase 10 times per second to get a Lucky Find. So yeah, people are not going to be dying in the final 30 seconds of a game anymore. Vines now deal a lot more damage. So vines used to deal 50 damage per second, and then for every second that would go along with you being in the vines, they would deal an extra 10 HP. So they'd deal 50 damage a second, then 60, 70, 80, 90 until you died, which would take a while. So you're now going to lose 10% of your troops' health per second, and it's going to increase 3% each second. And this means you can lose your entire squad in less than 10 seconds, when before you could survive in the vines for a lot longer than that. Also, healing while in vines is reduced by 80%. So if you've got a heal spell or you've got a poker, you're fighting in the vines, the healing won't do much. Get out the vines. I guess with this update, they're trying to make vines really scary. Anyways, that's it for all the balance changes. I hope you guys enjoyed the quick, snappy changes. Use code Claz in the Squad Busters shop if you buy anything in this update. I will be live streaming later today, by the way, so tune into that. I'm going to be playing ranked, showdown, and duos. And then if you want to watch more from me, check the video out on screen here. If you watch it, you can watch it. I would suggest tapping on it, please.